All right, I think we'll get underway. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Lessons and Insights from Municipal Housing Strategies in Ottawa, Montreal, and St. John's. My name is Jacob Gorenkoff, and I'm the Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives at the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm currently on in Ottawa is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. And as all of you are joining us today from many places near and far, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'm going to give a brief run through of the webinar technology for today. So today's webinar is in real time. You should soon be able to see a title screen of our first presentation of the session and be able to hear me via your computer speakers, headset, or through your telephone if you've chosen to dial in. As we're in webinar format, you're all muted. If you wish to ask questions, you can type them in the Q&A section on the webinar control panel at any time during the presentation, and we'll address as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar. Today, we will be hearing from Mathieu Fleury, Ottawa City Councillor for Rideau-Vanier and Chair of Ottawa Community Housing. Our second speaker will be Craig Sauvé, Associate Councillor to the Executive Committee for Housing in the City of Montreal. And our third speaker will be Krista Gladney, Affordable Housing and Development Facilitator of the Department of Community Services for the City of St. John's. Welcome, Mathieu, Craig, and Krista. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Jacob, for introducing us, and I'll get right to it if that works with everyone. So, Aaron, if you wouldn't mind sharing screen, I have a short presentation that I will share with you. It's a bridge of two worlds, and I thought, how do you start a presentation with a group across the country interested in housing without setting out the Ottawa context? Obviously, I want to shine the light on what we're doing with Ottawa Community Housing, and I'll be speaking to that in a few minutes. Ottawa Community Housing is the city's largest landlord, which I'm the chair of the board, but our single shareholder is the City of Ottawa. And although we have an independent board, I thought it was very insightful to begin today's presentation by sharing with you what's happening in Ottawa generally in terms of housing and homelessness, so that you have a bit of a snapshot of these struggles and opportunities along the way. And obviously, I'm a little biased, but I think Ottawa Community Housing is well placed to be an important part of the solution for the city. So the first slide will go right in maybe to a bit of the landscape in Ottawa. And some of you might know. Évidemment, je vais prendre vos questions à la fin en français si vous souhaitez. Sentez-vous à l'aise de les mettre dans le chat. Mais pour la séance aujourd'hui, je vais parler en anglais. Puis c'est simplement pour pour faciliter un petit peu la conversation. So a bit of a snapshot in Ottawa. We're a very wealthy city. We're 1 million in population. 80% of our land mass is agricultural. And as most cities in Ontario, we're an amalgamation of many smaller municipalities that's happened in 2001. Today's snapshot on housing and homelessness is the following. We have about 13,000 residents that are on a waiting list for an affordable unit. The majority of them are housed precariously and are paying too much for their housing when we look at the ratio. Of those 13,000, we have 2,000 who are every night sleeping at motels and shelters in our city. And we've seen that number continuing to increase. And as most large cities are seeing across Canada, we're seeing more and more encampments. If we go to the next one, what we're noticing is that shelters are really losing a bit of their insight. And I know many of you have been on the housing front for years. I've recognized that, which is we've invested so little or not moved the yardstick on housing, which has put all the pressure on homelessness and shelters. So we're seeing an increase in shelter use. We're seeing more and more residents in encampments. I was describing over the summer in Ottawa, we had close to 200 individuals who are either refusing services or not integrating the various services. And what we're noticing is that the majority of residents make shelter their home rather than being quickly through a few nights into the shelter, max 30 days, and into housing and support services, many find themselves to be in shelters for, unfortunately, many years. And within that, we have obviously a national conversation happening on reconciliation. We have many Inuit community members, and if you know Ottawa a little bit, they find themselves in one of the shelters at Shepherds of Good Hope, where now an entire floor of the shelter is dedicated to Inuit men and women that find themselves in vulnerable situations without a home. So Aaron, we'll go to the next one. So just to give you a bit of the look into the city, and we gave you what the city had prepared for a report, but I have last year's number, which would give you the 2020 number. So in 2020, which is not on the graph, we've spent $38 million to keep people in motels and shelters. If we take a look at what we've done as a city in housing, as a city, we've spent $15 million in housing. So we're willing to put, sadly, we're willing to put a lot more resources to ensure the operations of shelters and response is there. That's a significantly increased, but we don't have an immediate solution to investing in housing in terms of the same realm. So what does that create? Longer wait lists for affordable housing, more pressure in shelters and motels, more cost operationally onto the city. One of the situations in Ottawa, as I described, we're a large city in terms of land space, only 1 million in population. And we find ourselves that homelessness it's a citywide issue, but it's faced by a few communities in the downtown core. And the city as itself struggles, points fingers to different areas rather than looking at it from an entire city and bringing the political leadership tables to come forward with a comprehensive solution, which is part of the challenge in all of this. Let me take a quick snap down at my notes here. So we put a lot of resources in sustaining shelters, making sure that folks aren't on the street, but we're putting too little attention to shifting the model and ensuring that residents in Ottawa have a key to a unit with the home that they deserve that's affordable. So that's been a bit of a clash locally where, the older shelter models have a strong lobby, they pull at heartstrings, specifically on local media and some who are more traditional, and continue to show the need, while we all know the attention and investment needs to go into the housing front. So let's talk about solutions and how we can get there. Shift in investment approach. So we know that with a few continued targeted investments, we can start shifting the landscapes. And when you look within our shelter population, talked earlier about Indigenous communities. So we know we have to work with Indigenous local organizations to unlock housing, urban Indigenous strategies here in Ottawa. We have a lot of families in shelters, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But one of them is we can't use the old Trump's in power, or there's an influx of asylum seekers from the United States. It just hasn't happened over the last year, yet our motels continue to be used. So we got to rethink the approach. We got to think about it differently. And that brings me to what the research says. I know that many of you would know the research locally that's drawn some attention nationally is obviously around housing first. And that's Tim Overy and the team at the University of Ottawa has done tremendous work. Let me give you a bit of a snapshot here in Ottawa. So in 2014, to keep someone in a shelter with all of the services that are attached to that, and assuming the emergency responses that are required throughout the year and healthcare, that would cost our collective about $114,000 during the year. And that's in 2014. That's significantly increased. As you know, many in our shelters, many individuals in our shelters are suffering from addictions and mental health. And that has shifted as well with the opioid crisis. But two of the elements, and no one's debating that housing first is the right investment. Locally, there's been a dilution of that with some supportive housing asks that have come to be. And ultimately, though, it's not the worst when you start looking at some of the outdated standing model, including transitionary housing, that's often a bit of an old terminology and a bit of an older approach that we need to invest. And I could speak to the struggles in Ottawa of engaging with housing first. We have seen some challenges, although the program and its study has shown tremendous success for all ranges of folks in homelessness, facing homelessness, as you know. So the City of Ottawa and I have approved a plan. I was one with a few others who didn't support the city's plan. If you see, I was sharing with you earlier that we have about 13,000 people on the waiting list waiting for an affordable housing. And if you look at your screen, this is a snapshot of the staff report, but the goals of the city over the next 10 years until 2030 is only to find a solution for 8,500. That does not assume a solution to today, and it doesn't assume the growth in affordable housing needs throughout that period. So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars without capturing the current pressures and the current growth, and ultimately, even today, without resolving the amount of residents and families that are on the waiting list for an affordable unit. So where do we go from here? Well, we look at what the city's done. So in Ontario, as you might know, housing has been pushed down to municipalities. Locally, we used to spend very little, although we did back end some provincial and federal programs that have come to be over the years. But in the last 2 years, we've spent $15 million a year to kickstart new capital investments. And that's been a good start, but as I've advocated for, we have to match, from my perspective, we should at least match the amount that we're spending yearly in shelters and motels, which last year alone was $38 million, in new investments in housing. If the City of Ottawa does that, then I think it's in a better position to advocate to provincial and federal governments in that regards. So now let me move to the solutions, because I know it can weigh heavy when you start looking at these challenges and these problems and the amounts of investments. So I'll turn to now my role as OCH. And Jacob, I'll need about 5 minutes. Am I still on time for another 5 or so?
Yeah, 5's fine.
Perfect. So Aaron, if we could go to the next slide. So Ottawa Community Housing is the city's largest landlord. We have 15,000 units. We're the 4th largest provider in the country, and we house every night 32,000 tenants. Ottawa Community Housing, I've been on the board now for 11 years. It's shifted completely. It's shifted in having an acute understanding of its portfolio. Although we have an aging portfolio, we've invested in our high-rise, which have the good bones of a building. So we're reinvesting in making those more energy-friendly and renewing those assets. And we're looking at more of our townhouses, our family communities, and we're reinvesting, redeveloping those. So our focus has been to really improve our standards for the tenant experience and our tenant response. And on the other hand, really put in place a development mind frame. We want to move away from the year-to-year RFPs, which were 40, 50, 60 units a year, and we want to explode that. So OCH is a good example of that. It's what you see on the left side is a passive house, the largest in Canada, that's built in the city's core. It's the way OCH does it. It does market rent, below market rent, rent geared to income. It creates complete communities now in its new built form. It's passive house standards, which has really kickstarted. And our goal over the next 10 years to build 10,000 units. So we've targeted communities where we're working with the tenants, we're working with the stakeholders, the community, to ensure that no one is moved out of their community, but that we do the Tetris within the community so that we can demolish sections of the community while we reinvest, and while people, once there's a new building, can reintegrate into a new household. So our goal is over the next 10 years to build 10,000 new units in mixed income, mixed development environments. We've been very successful in partnering with the existing programs, the co-investment fund, specifically through the federal government and CMHC. We have 3 large parcels in the city's core, and for the time being, we've confirmed 4 new buildings of just under 700 units that will be built, and some are starting, as you can see by the screen, some are starting again this year. I'll move to maybe the last kind of pieces to food for thought. So one of the opportunities for an organization like OCH, and I'm sure it's the same in your city, is that you have a public housing provider. You might have multiple. Whoop. You still there? Jacob, I'm sorry, can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. I got a bizarre cue from Zoom. So OCH is a good example. It owns a lot of land, and it houses a lot of folks. So I'd move your eye to the bottom right of the screen of the graph. If you give us less than $30 million a year in equity, we can build 1,000 units a year. That's very, very affordable when you start thinking of how quickly you can move up units. Why? Because we can leverage the existing portfolio, the existing loans, the existing equity that we have within the organization. And that's the mind frame we've come in with CMHC. That's the conversations we're having with the city, and it's been fruitful in many respects, although we need to continue to grow. And unfortunately, in some instances, the province has been slow coming in our case. The City of Ottawa has taken advantage of the rapid housing investment, although we've seen the challenges of such a program in terms of speed and in terms of value. The program has some limitations, as many of you would know, relating to modular housing. I'll leave you with the final thought on CMHC. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us in the public sector, but I do think that additional programs there need to be enable organizations like OCH and other public housing providers in large cities, particularly, and medium-sized cities, to really stretch its equity goals and really build a lot more units. So, Jacob, I'll leave it at that. If there are questions, I'm glad to come back on.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mathieu. Now, Craig, it's your turn to give us a nice presentation.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you, Mathieu, for that interesting presentation. So I'm from Montreal, the city of Montreal, and obviously, as all our audience knows, things sometimes work a little bit differently in Quebec, and I mean that's the case in our federation. That province to province, there's different rules, different ways of going, and so I'll have a little presentation that I'll just share with you now, and hopefully the vocabulary I'll try to make sure we're all on the same terms, because again, also sometimes in Quebec we use a bit of different vocabulary. Let me just locate that here. Oh, 1 second. This is the one. And we're sharing, good, lovely. Let me just get that screen. Okay, so here's my presentation, Housing Solutions Montreal Style. In Montreal, we've been very hyperactive on the housing file for the past 4 years. It's a new administration for the past 4 years, and we're going to election later this year, but it was one of the things we campaigned on. It's one of our major issues. Montreal and Quebec have known to have a fairly affordable housing stock if you compare with other Canadian metropolises and big cities, but we've lost a lot of that advantage in the past decade or so, and we're losing it still fast. So we've been on a very, the housing groups have been on high alert, even more so now recently, and the city of Montreal is trying to do its part. And like I said, things sometimes work a little differently in Quebec. For example, Quebec is responsible for 90% of the funding, for social housing development, for example. But they did give us new interesting powers that I'm going to discuss in this presentation. So, like I said, Montreal sort of stands out for mixed neighborhoods, for its more affordable neighborhoods. And there is a massive diversity of neighborhoods like many big cities. But we also, similar to Mathieu, in Ottawa, we've seen a high demand for social housing, and our list is, we always sort of evaluate around between 20 and 22,000 people that are on the list for social housing, and the people in various situations. Obviously, if it's a more chronic and emergency situation, they get put up the list, but there are people who've been on there for a decade on that list. We are seeing that rapid rise in prices I mentioned even the pandemic has been absolutely bonkers here, with prices going through the roof in all areas surrounding Montreal and places of Quebec. Something's going on in the economy that in the housing markets that I'm really looking forward to getting some studies on after this pandemic is over. Why are we, exploding in prices all over Canada? There is an erosion, as I mentioned, of affordable housing rental stock, and there's a shortage and offer of larger units, of family size units. And one of the big issues in Montreal too is we have a lot of big suburban space, and we want people to stay in the city. We want to reverse urban sprawl. We want to fight against all those beautiful, lovely farmlands that feed us being taken over by development, and we want to cool down traffic. And so we want to really fight urban sprawl. So we need families to stay in the city. And obviously everything's really complicated, but here are housing solutions. So here are major levers that we are operating by. We put together a bylaw of great importance. We call it the bylaw for a mixed metropolis. It's an inclusionary zoning bylaw. To my knowledge, it's the most powerful in North America. We got it because the Quebec government did give us habilitating powers, we call it pouvoirs habilitants, in housing in Quebec to do so, and I'll explain this bylaw a little bit, but it's one of the pieces that are very important to the work we've been doing recently that we will hope we do hope will generate a lot of social and affordable housing. We've also been undergoing massive land acquisitions. The city's buying up the land before other developers snap it up and put a really profitable piece on there. We want to get in control of it so it's under public ownership, and then we can try to create social housing or other off-market, non-commodified housing on it. And we've been doing that by straight up purchases, but we've also created a right of first refusal bylaw in Montreal. So we have several hundred lots that we can have the first snap at if there's never offer placed. We have an opportunity to jump in and take it up at the same price. So that's one of the other major pieces that we're doing. And again, partnerships with groups in the housing sectors. We have the RGRTs, we call them the Groupes de Ressources Techniques. These are the social economy, architectural firms, and the sort of social real estate firms that are putting together the social housing developments, whether they be cooperative or nonprofits of other sorts, community, or with other groups. We have obviously our municipal housing authority, which is the OMHM, l'Office Municipal d'Habitation de Montréal, the SHDM, which is the Société d'Habitation de Montréal, and that's et développement, and so that's the sort of like the sort of para-municipal, sort of private but affordable housing development firm. That's also, so they're again sort of independent from the city of Montreal, those two last groups, but they actually do a lot for our development of affordable and nonprofit housing. And then the fourth piece, I think, for our change is housing sanitation. There's a lot of the rental stock out there that is still affordable, but people are living in awful circumstances that would drive most of us to move, right? Particularly, newly arrived Canadians or Canadians in other vulnerable situations, really low income Montrealers. Bed bugs, mold, all infestations of all sorts of rats and stuff. So we've put a lot of money into hiring more inspectors, giving them better tools, and then going after landlords that are not following through with their obligations. And so we've been doing these massive blitzes. I mean, before like a couple of years ago, they were using pens and papers and then going back to the office and filling out Excel forms. Now they're on iPads and they can send the report out straight after, doing an inspection. And so we've trained more. We've also got social liaisons. So we do a big blitz with a lot of inspectors. Some vulnerable people that might feel they're being attacked. They're not the ones being attacked, they're the ones we're trying to help. So we have social workers that come with us and do that work and help them do the inspection, so that people feel empowered and not afraid by our inspectors. So that's something new as well that we've developed. Our big operation to build, sort of similar to what Mathieu is saying, they want to go for 10,000. We're going for 12,000 in a shorter time period, but two different types. So 6,000 in social housing units, which is the off-market, cooperative, community, HLM typical stuff, and then the affordable, which is our sub-market. So when you hear affordable in Quebec, it means sub-market. So we've increased support for the actual development of social and community housing. I mentioned those land buys before, those land acquisitions. That's a big piece. I mentioned our bylaw for a diverse metropolis in line 2 here. That's a really big piece too. So that's an obligatory contribution to affordable housing and social housing in every development. I will continue. Oh, there we go. 3 innovative affordable housing options. We created a fund for a $10 million yearly fund for housing innovation. All those cool programs that come that don't fit any of the governmental programs, don't fit the existing Montreal programs, but that deserve, you know, a chance to show off some new housing ideas. So that's something we've been able to put together new projects, and hopefully that will influence the development of projects. I mentioned, sanitation, but there's also the preservation and reservation of what exists, the renovation of what exists. So we do have programs as well to help landowners, landlords fix up what they have, and makes their lives a little bit easier. It shows that we're trying to contribute to help the lives of renters as well. And renters, having proper bathrooms, having non-moldy homes, having homes that are much more livable and clean, and that will keep pressure off obviously off the market for people moving out everywhere into other neighborhoods. We want to have every neighborhood to have the same amount of affordable and clean and lovely rental stock. And we've also have the support of the acquisition of affordable properties. So those are for first-time buyers. We want to keep those young families in Montreal. So we have a series of programs for them that were existence in Montreal, and we've just recently completely retooled our program to make sure that it doesn't get flipped and then it doesn't get sold for profit quickly. We now have perennial affordable housing. So if you're a first-time buyer, you can get in. You can't flip out for a big profit. It only goes with small margins up at the market. So a lot better program. But I did want to mention, let's see if I can, there we go. Oh, here we are. This is the big piece I mentioned before. It's our big bylaw for a mixed metropolis. And it's a very complicated bylaw. Obviously, the housing market's complicated. Every part of the city is different. But in general, we used to call it the 20-20-20 bylaw, because the idea being every development over a certain amount of units would have to require investments in social housing at a level of 20%, investments in affordable housing at a level of 20%, and investments in family housing. That means 3 bedrooms or more. So again, it varies on the neighborhood, and that's all available online in our bylaw. But the idea is if we have a big development coming, of over 50 units, we want to try to get some land next to that development so we can put some social housing right there and get the Quebec government to invest and build social housing there. So we want this new bylaw will allow us to take land, and it's obligatory. And if you want to get a permit to construct in Montreal now for over 5 units, you still need to comply with this bylaw now. So it's a very strong obligatory bylaw for obligatory contributions. So for big projects, we might get some land for social housing. The developers themselves might want to do turnkey contributions, build it themselves if they own the construction company as well, or they can pay out with the financial contribution so that we can put it in our accounts to buy more land and to help further social housing development, for example. Very powerful stuff. And the financial people sometimes criticize, they go, well, everybody's just going to pay out. We made it a lot more expensive, and we made it in such a way that we're trying to incite people to give us the land rather than take the money, because the land has more value to us at this time. So it's a very expensive financial contribution that's required now. And the affordable housing bylaw, you can seed an existing building, you can create a new building. Again, this is that sub-market sort of affordable housing. Could be rental affordable housing too. And we can go through a program of an existing program, or our new program that I mentioned, we completely retooled that will allow perennial affordable housing without there being a massive flip after the first buy or massive profits being derived. So that's something I can give you more details if people want. And we've done these sectors now for this affordable housing in areas where there is going to be big densification, i.e. brownfields, old industrial areas that are now being residentialized. There's the old Molson Brewery that's out in the east end of Montreal, for example. That's a good spot. by the new REM stations in the Ville Saint Laurent area and the boroughs of Saint Laurent area. So there's bonus zoning, and that's where the actual building of this affordable housing is going to go. I mentioned also the third piece of this bylaw, which is the family housing. So we require now in buildings of 50 units or more, 3 bedrooms or more apartments, and 20% of the units must be 3 bedrooms or more. And we want to create that larger stock of available housing, and we know obviously that it could turn into penthouses in some occasions with larger, with 3 bedrooms. But we're trying to just make sure over the time that there will be these more larger available buildings. And so far, we've seen in the projects that are being developed that indeed developers are seeing the interest in keeping families, and not just multimillionaires, but actual regular average families in it. And in our social housing, it can count it within our social housing contribution as well. So it can go within the first bracket there that you see before you. So we are already seeing a development of more family housing for average and low income Montrealers as well with this bylaw. In order to implement it, I'm almost done, don't worry. In order to implement it, we did a vast public consultation that took 2 years. We did bring major changes because we had a first version. We had the real estate market. We had a lot of developers there. We had the activist groups. We had social housing activist groups. We had economists. We even did 2 massive economic impact studies to see if the construction industry, how it was going to get affected, how the housing industry was going to get affected, and whether there would increase cost of housing for everybody in Montreal. Long story short, no. Maybe the first year of the implementation, there would be a short, small increase, particularly in the downtown core. But other than that, according to the study we commissioned, it seems like it's going to flatline it into a regular housing market situation. We also have a monitoring committee that exists with the construction industry and housing groups in order to see how this bylaw is going to be, because it's only in effect this year, and it will see over the next few years how it's affecting the housing market and how it's generating social housing and how it's generating affordable housing and family housing, and where there's improvements can be made, because obviously bylaws are meant to be evaluative, right? So here are the benefits we expect just from this bylaw alone. We expect land for about 600 social housing units per year, about $14 million in financial contributions, so we can go buy more land. We expect to generate about 500 family units, and important potential for affordable units that I mentioned in those bonus zoning areas, and we already have a few areas designed. Oops. Oh, same. There we are. Thank you very much. I hope that's clear, and looking forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Craig. That was a really interesting presentation. And before we get to our Q&A period, I'm going to hand the floor to Krista from St. John's.
Okay, I'm just trying to share my screen, but I have to wait for Craig to stop sharing his. Here we go. I'm going to switch this again. Done.
Sorry, Krista, we can still see
Yeah,
your notes.
I know. I'm trying to remember how I did that last time. Sorry, I gotta switch. Apologies. Do you know how to switch it? Toggle the screen here.
I think if you go up to display.
I got it. Yeah, I got it there. I think.
If you go up to display settings, I think you might need to do something like presenter view up a little bit more. And to the left.
Left.
Look at the top bar, show taskbar,
Right.
right after display settings.
Yeah.
Right after. Yeah, click on that.
There we
Should be
go.
able-
Yeah. Is it there? No, it's missing. Sorry, I'm having all sorts of, let me try stopping and sharing again. We had it working before we logged in, so. Share. Not sure what's going on. There we go. Better now?
Looks good.
Perfect. Sorry about that. Thanks, everyone. I apologize. My cameras have not working here today either. Having all sorts of tech issues. Thanks for having me here today. Before I begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, of which the city of St. John's is the capital city, as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk. And of course, we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Mi'kmaq, Innu, Inuit, and Southern Inuit of our province as well. So our affordable housing strategy was built from a strong foundation of public engagement and research on local housing situation and emerging trends. And it was approved by council in November 2018, runs from 2019 to 2028, and uses the 30% rule as a definition for affordable housing. So in St. John's, according to this rule, we know that approximately 1 in 4 households are living in unaffordable housing. And like in other places, we see this more for renter households than owner households as well. And similar to others, we've been seeing an increase in our wait list for social housing as well. And despite having a high vacancy rate, we're certainly seeing a lot of competition in the local market since the pandemic for the more affordable units, for especially for 1 and 2 bedrooms. So the city's affordable housing strategy really works to provide more housing choices with a focus placed on households that are too low to afford market rents or purchasing options, that with an income too high to be eligible for social housing, but too low to afford market rents or purchasing options. But we don't stop there. We know that housing exists on a continuum extending from homelessness through to affordable housing, followed by market housing. The city does act as a provider of social housing with a portfolio of 476 housing units. And we continue to support the efforts of End Homelessness St. John's, which is the Reaching Home community entity in St. John's, as they implement their community plan to end homelessness. So our strategy really incorporates and encourages continued collaborative efforts across the entire housing continuum with the goal of improving situations for people and families for whom affordable housing is a concern. So the mission of our strategy is for the city of St. John's to leverage its unique capacities and build strong partnerships to produce, protect, and promote affordable housing for the people of St. John's. And we do this with a vision that St. John's will be a vibrant, inclusive, and thriving city with a wide range of affordable housing options that contribute directly to community health, sustainable growth, and economic security. So the strategy does have kind of 6 pillars or strategic components, and I will get into these in a little bit more detail in the following slides. But just a quick overview, they include unlocking resources, building homes, leading innovation, revitalizing policy, cultivating partnerships, and informing action. So looking at unlocking resources, we're really striving to identify and draw on the city's resources and assets that we have to advance any housing initiatives and create new opportunities. So one thing that we've established under this is really looking internally at our resources, and we've established an interdepartmental committee, which consists of not just our housing division, but planning and development, traffic engineering, our regulatory services, our family and leisure services, which oversees a lot of like inclusionary type things, communications, and we bring in other departments as required. So that could be legal or our parks and open spaces or whatnot. Under this initiative as well, they also strive to create a list of city-owned vacant land similar to other municipalities and buildings, and we evaluate this for potential for redevelopment. So we have identified just 4 parcels of land so far. And we've signed a letter of intent on one of these with Habitat for Humanity. And we're also doing engagement on the 3 remaining parcels. So there's no planned project on those parcels at this point. We wanted to do engagement in advance to understand how citizens and stakeholders use those parcels of land, what their concerns are about a development there, or how we might be able to address that, and looking at, if they have any ideas on what types of housing they'd like to see, what things they'd like to see incorporated, retail space or community space, that type of thing. So that's ongoing. And then under this component as well, we're also looking to create our Civic Housing Action Fund. So council has approved the sale of a unit of housing that was acquired by the city for another purpose, so not through any sort of operating grant, and to use those funds for the creation of our Civic Housing Action Fund that we can then use to leverage additional streams of funding through provincial or federal sources. Next up, we are looking at, of course, building homes. We'd like to increase the stock and sustainability of affordable rental and home ownership opportunities. And some of the implementation strategies in here are working on tenancy issues. We really want to share information about eviction prevention, community supports available, rights and responsibilities as a tenant. So in 2019, the city released an updated Your Rights and Responsibilities as a Tenant Guide, which reflected most recent changes to the Newfoundland and Labrador Residential Tenancies Act. And we translated this it's available in English, French, and Arabic. We'd also strive to address property standard violations and look for opportunities to expand on our existing inspection program partnerships. So our inspection services division has created what we call a safe and healthy housing presentation, which is used to engage multiple stakeholders in a collaborative approach to address inadequate housing. And it really gives service providers the knowledge to know what to look for if they're going into a unit for a tenant that they're supporting, and how to report it and move forward. So we're really trying to tackle some standard housing with that approach. And another item under here, and just giving a little snapshot, there's actually a lot more directions under each of these, as I'm sure there are for the other plans, but these are some of the key things we've been doing. We've also leveraged our own housing portfolio to increase the supply of affordable housing units. So we do have vacancies in our lower end of market, particularly the 3 and 4 bedroom units. We're seeing a much more demand for 1 and 2 bedrooms than the larger family units in St. John's. So what we've done is actually partnered with some nonprofit organizations to convert some of the vacant housing units into supported housing beds that they're managing. And then we are also engaging with other service providers for similar opportunities. Leading innovation is another key component that we look at for our strategy. And of course, we really want to think differently about housing, inspire new ideas and new opportunities. So one of the things we do is offer our Housing Catalyst grants. And the grant is meant to give us first spark to affordable housing ideas that we hope will then springboard into bigger outcomes. And so the city has been offering these grants since 2016, so prior to this particular strategy. And in 2020, we actually developed a new partnership with the Community Housing Transformation Center to increase the value of the fund and the grants. Projects have included things like creating a Yes in My Backyard video, pre-construction and design costs, completing needs assessment, particularly for some targeted groups, portfolio and asset management planning, resource creation, and certainly also funded a prototype for a net zero affordable tiny home. That's just a few of the types of projects that we've been supporting through that fund. We've also been looking to, increase knowledge of energy efficiency. We completed a pilot project working with partners to do a retrofit on some of our city-owned housing units. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to host a housing design competition. It was originally kind of scheduled for last year, but it wasn't really a key year for bringing people together for that kind of thing. So hopefully in the future, that's something we can implement. Certainly, revitalizing policy is a key thing here in terms of affordable housing in St. John's. We really want to look at our own policies and changes that could support housing need and identify areas outside of the city authority, so provincial jurisdiction, for instance, where we can advocate for change. We also include things in here like providing incentives for affordable housing development. So we've expanded our exemption of municipal fees, including development and building permit fees for private developers who have confirmed investment in affordable housing funding and also funding from the national strategy streams. And we've been waiving these fees for all charities for quite some time. We allow flexibility for affordable housing parking requirements on a case-by-case basis. And we waive property taxes for properties that's held and occupied by charitable organizations or institutions, or if the property is part of a low rental housing project as defined in the National Housing Act. Another key item under here is our municipal plan and development regulations. So just last week, after many years of work, Council approved the new Envision St. John's Municipal Plan Development Regulations. And this was prepared as a result of a comprehensive review developed from an extensive consultation process and the comments of many interested citizens, community groups, property owners, businesses, with the direction of council and professional input of our city staff. So some of the items in our Envision document include things like allowing subsidiary dwellings in as many residential zones as possible, incorporating provisions for tiny homes and micro units, which are really new to St. John's, supporting intensification and mixed-use development, particularly along transit corridors as well, allowing small apartment buildings in some of our residential zones where these were not permitted, and continuing to require new developments to consult with our Transportation Commission to ensure that any new affordable housing areas also have, or many of the new developments have access to public transport. Next, we have cultivating partnership. Of course, we can't do this alone. We certainly need our partners to help to address affordable housing issues in the city of St. John's. So we work with all levels of government, private, and community partners to address these issues, and we support their work as well. One of the things we did mention is we support End Homelessness St. John's. Again, they're working on the homelessness side of the spectrum. We also have our affordable housing working group, which consists of city staff, our deputy mayor, who's our council lead for housing in the city, provincial and federal government counterparts, and we have End Homelessness, the Canadian Home Builders Association, Habitat for Humanity, First Light is a local organization, works with Indigenous peoples, and Stella's Circle as well as another local nonprofit. So we have a mix of government and community partners that kind of oversee the strategy. We've also been working to try and align our social housing wait list between the city and also with the province, as we both have units within the city of St. John's. We have a lot of duplication of people who are on both lists. So really trying to streamline that process for a more coordinated approach. And then we, of course, we share information throughout the community. Lastly, we have informing action. So we really want to raise awareness and educate the impact housing needs has on our community health, sustainable growth, and economic security. We continue to plan. So every year we plan affordable housing forums, which includes all sorts of people in the sector, nonprofits, levels of government, may include private developers, sometimes landlords. We really want to increase the understanding of universal design and energy efficiency as a function of housing affordability. And we have been taking a targeted approach to address not in my backyard or NIMBY attitudes. Just this past year, we've launched a social marketing campaign that really asks people to consider what affordable housing means to them and to reflect on their perceptions and beliefs related to affordable housing. That includes some videos, some social media polls, that kind of thing. And we really hope to debunk some of the myths associated with affordable housing. Under our strategy as well, we've also committed to conducting a housing needs assessment update every 3 years to really guide where we go with the strategy. The strategy is designed to be really flexible and to pivot when we need to pivot, depending on what's going on in our community. And certainly the housing needs assessments will help inform that as well. So I know this is a pretty brief snapshot, but certainly if anybody would like to find out more, we do our strategy and some of the other documents and presentations are available on our website. We have an engage page where residents and stakeholders can provide comments on any of the projects that we are working on. We're available on social media, and I'm certainly happy to take any questions by email or phone at the numbers provided.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great presentation, Krista. We're now going to open the floor to any comments or questions. To everybody in the audience, if you haven't done so already, you can enter those questions in the Q&A box on the webinar control panel at any time. So we currently have one from Joanna. I think it's directed to Craig. Craig, would you be able to talk a little bit more about your perennial housing concept?
Right. So thanks for the question, and thanks to my two co-panelists for their interesting presentations. It gives me ideas, and it's fun. I'm going to go check out your website after for sure. So the idea is, we had a program initially whereby people, first-time buyers, families could get into the housing market as owners through what we called an accès condo. Was like that's the name of our program. And previously, the issue was that they would get in, and then once they had the possession of the unit, which sometimes we use to try to generate affordable in certain neighborhoods, they could, they could sell it on the free market afterwards, on the real estate market. So you would have people flipping, and there were some occasions even, and this is awful, where the developers themselves in offering, affordable housing units in their programs and in their projects, would use other names and other company names and buy the units up and then flip them themselves. So it was a loophole that was really problematic in Montreal that we tried to close. And so, in fact, I mentioned when we did our big bylaw, there was a massive consultation. That was one of the issues that came up. So we created a new bylaw on how to create affordable housing and keep it affordable. And yes, if you have you're the first time into the market and you want to get into the market, obviously, you need to accrue some equity in your home. So in the bylaw, we gave it an actual number about how much the value is allowed to accrue for 30 years. And that number is 3%. It's allowed to go plus 3% per year. Obviously, that number can be changed given whatever the housing market is asking, but we figured that there's been a very constant level of inflation in Canada. That's been around 2%, so we said 3%. And here the housing market goes up by a lot more. It goes up by about 5%. So, and how do we choose these people? Well, there's a period of accompaniment with the city. Obviously we have to look at what their income is as well. So because they're actually directed towards people that we want to get into the market and they're having a hard time because they can't afford. So we've actually set a barrier as well of what is the maximum income that this household is allowed to have if they want to profit from this program. We set that at 3.5 is the magic number. So the value of the apartment that we're selling, the condo that we're selling, divided by 3.5. So let's say if it's 450 divided by 3.5, it's about 140,000. That's the maximum the household is allowed to make in order to profit from this type of unit. And obviously the definition of affordable housing for us is 90% of the cost of the local market in the neighborhood. And so that can be defined also based on the neighborhood we find this house in. So it's a complicated prospect, but that's the system we're using in general. So we make sure that the buyers themselves are people that need a helping hand to enter the housing market. We make sure that they can't accrue value for more than 3% over 30 years. And there's a basis of the actual, we want it to be sub-market value, so something a little cheaper than what goes on the market. And I should say too, after the 30 years in the bylaw, the city has a right to repurchase and put it back into its program or to keep it going with a renewed program. So it gives us that option of keeping it for another 30 years if we want. And that's also in the bylaw. So it's a pretty innovative tool that we've created here. And it's just come into effect this year. So I mentioned again, we are doing monitoring on how it's going to work, and we can sort of tweak numbers as things go as well. So that's the basic functioning of this program.
Awesome, thanks, Craig. So next question. Can you speak to some of, or I guess in some additional ways or in greater depth, that you've been encouraging innovation or the adoption of new ideas and practices within the housing and homelessness space in your cities? Maybe Mathieu or Krista, did you want to jump in first?
Sure. Well, being the capital city, we have amazing opportunities when it comes to federal lands. We know how the pandemic has sort of reset a bit of the office uses in the city's core. We're waiting on a number of fronts. What will the federal government do in terms of its own assets? And then how are these assets, these office spaces coming up for market? We've seen the private sector convert hotel spaces in the city's core into new rental or renovated rental, I'd say. So that's offered some window. I think, our struggle is the pressure from everyone, right? Where who's accessing the land. At times in Ottawa, it's been challenging because the feds leverage the Canada Lands Corporation as an entity, but that entity has a very different mandate than, say, CMHC or even a local government. So we're often trying to integrate ourselves into it. The fundamentals of if we know if we're doing it right for us is whatever the program is, are we seeing an increase in units? If so, that's a positive. And the second lever is, are we actually plugging into the city's waiting lists? And that's been part of the criticisms of the current federal financing program, is that the private sector picks up those big buildings and gets very favorable interest rates. But then the affordable units that are signed for as part of those agreements don't make their way to getting folks off the waiting list. So, someone that's wealthy, a bit like Craig was describing, but in a more of a rental sense, people are picking up affordable, or what's quote unquote affordable units without needing the affordability necessarily. So, a glimpse of some of the situations here. There's tremendous opportunity with public land. There's tremendous opportunity with changing workforce and office spaces in the city's core.
Hi, yeah. Can you repeat the question just one more time there, Jacob?
Yeah, sure. But basically, the question was just about what ways you're encouraging innovation or the adoption of new ideas or practices within the housing and homelessness space in your city.
Yeah, so one of the key things we do there is through our Housing Catalyst Fund grants that we do. And certainly we've funded several kind of innovative ideas or things that are really looking at our housing sector and trying to do things a little bit differently. We have, for instance, one grant we just recently funded is looking at, how we develop kind of more co-housing and house sharing projects, which have proved to be a little bit challenging in social housing. Looking at that. Yeah, and I guess that's kind of the key things that we do under that side of things. And we're also looking at our own units and how do we use those differently. So we've been really trying to reach out and develop more partnerships to get more people into housing where we may be limited in doing so, especially looking at, our bigger units where they haven't been, where we've had more vacancies. How do we utilize those units to the best of their ability?
Thanks, Krista. Recognizing that we're at 2 o'clock, Craig, did you want to add a concluding comments before we wrap up?
Well, I think some of the best ideas, like our co-panelists were saying, come from the housing sectors in our cities and our provinces that are super vibrant and interesting. And I know in Montreal, we have, all the way from, the completely, anti-capitalist groups to the high financiers. There's a lot of ideas in there. And so sometimes listening to them and trying to give them the tools to put forth their project is a great way to stimulate innovation.
Awesome, thanks, Craig. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for our webinar today. Mathieu, Craig, and Krista, thank you so much for the great presentations. Very, very interesting, and I'm really happy that we're able to welcome you today. Also to our audience, thank you for tuning in. We're going to be sending a follow-up email in the coming days. Thanks, everybody. Take care and stay safe.